Some people become emotionally exhausted long before adulthood. Not because they're weak, because they learn too early that being understood is never guaranteed. So they start watching themselves constantly. Their voice, their body language, their reactions, their personality, their emotions, their silence. They learn how to emotionally scan rooms before they fully enter them. Who feels safe? Who feels performatively accepting? Who will tolerate them until they become emotionally inconvenient? That kind of hyper-awareness changes the nervous system, especially when it starts young. And Gen Z became the first LGBTQ+ generation forced to experience that hyper-awareness publicly, all the time, online, the school, inside relationships, inside friend groups, inside dating culture, inside identity culture itself. There's never a moment where the self fully stops being observed anymore. And eventually, people stop feeling like human beings. They start feeling like emotionally monitored identities. That's why so many Gen Z people feel exhausted in ways they can't fully explain. Because this isn't normal stress. It's psychological overexposure. The kind that slowly disconnects people from themselves while making them appear socially functional. And the terrifying part is, most people around them never notice it happening. Because emotionally exhausted people usually don't look broken. They look adapted. That's what makes it dangerous. Especially for queer people who spent years learning emotional survival before they ever learned emotional safety. Because LGBTQ+ people often grow up translating themselves emotionally before they even understand themselves fully. Explaining who they are, softening who they are, testing reactions carefully, editing behavior unconsciously, preparing emotionally for misunderstanding before conversations even begin. That creates emotional hypervigilance, a constant internal monitoring system. And once someone learns to emotionally monitor themselves for survival, they rarely stop completely, even in safe environments. The body remembers. That's why some LGBTQ+ people still feel emotionally tense around people who genuinely love them. Because acceptance does not instantly erase years of psychological anticipation. Safety can feel unfamiliar after prolonged emotional unpredictability. And unfamiliar things often feel dangerous, especially when modern culture rewards visibility more than emotional understanding. That's the contradiction destroying so many Gen Z people psychologically. They are more visible than any generation before them, while simultaneously feeling emotionally unseen. Social media created an environment where identity is constantly exposed, but rarely deeply understood. And for queer people, that pressure multiplies. Because online identity culture quietly turns identity into performance. Not intentionally, algorithmically, people learn very quickly which versions of themselves receive validation, which aesthetics get engagement, which emotional tones get rewarded, which identities become socially profitable, which forms of vulnerability feel acceptable online. So eventually, people stop expressing themselves naturally. They begin emotionally curating themselves. Carefully, strategically, almost professionally. That changes people. Quietly. Because when identity becomes performative long enough, people start losing connection to the parts of themselves that exist outside observation. And Gen Z grew up inside that system. A generation raised through cameras, algorithms, reaction metrics, public opinion loops, continuous emotional accessibility. There's never silence anymore, only exposure. That's why emotional exhaustion feels different now. It's not just burnout from responsibilities. It's burnout from psychological visibility, from constantly being reachable, interpretable, comparable, observable. People don't just live anymore. They experience themselves being watched while living. That creates a disturbing split inside the brain. One part experiences emotions. The other part monitors how those emotions appear externally. And eventually, the monitoring becomes stronger than the feeling itself. That's why so many people feel disconnected from their own emotions now. Not because they became emotionless, because self-surveillance interrupted emotional presence. Especially online, where people no longer ask, "How do I feel?" They ask, "How will this version of me be perceived?" That question changes identity permanently. And LGBTQ+ people often experience this earlier than others because queer identity has historically required self-awareness for survival. But social media transformed self-awareness into self-surveillance. Those are completely different things. Self-awareness creates understanding. Self-surveillance creates exhaustion. And Gen Z became trapped inside systems rewarding self-surveillance constantly. Every post, every photo, every reply, every delayed response, every story view, every reaction. People now emotionally interpret each other through fragments. Tiny digital behaviors. A slower reply suddenly feels threatening. A shorter message feels suspicious. A tone shift feels catastrophic. Because modern communication removed emotional stability from connection, especially in dating culture. Dating apps transformed intimacy into endless comparison psychology. People no longer feel chosen. They feel temporarily prioritized. And those are not the same thing. That's why so many Gen Z relationships feel emotionally unstable before they even begin. Everyone knows replacement is one swipe away. Someone more attractive, more confident, more emotionally convenient, more aesthetically optimized. That creates subconscious attachment paranoia everywhere, even among emotionally intelligent people, especially among emotionally wounded people. And queer dating culture often intensifies this exhaustion because many LGBTQ+ people already struggle with emotional scarcity. Scarcity of understanding. Scarcity of safe connection. Scarcity of emotional consistency. Scarcity of long-term emotional security. So when someone finally feels emotionally chosen, the fear of losing that connection becomes psychologically overwhelming. That's why reassurance addiction became so common. People don't just want love anymore. They want proof they haven't become emotionally replaceable. Again, and again, and again. But modern relationships rarely provide stable reassurance long enough for nervous systems to calm down. Because modern intimacy rewards stimulation more than stability, attention more than understanding, accessibility more than emotional presence, desirability more than emotional safety. That creates emotionally exhausted relationships. Relationships where people constantly monitor each other emotionally instead of relaxing into connection, checking replies, scanning energy shifts, analyzing silence, detecting distance. People become investigators inside intimacy, not participants. And the frightening part is, many people now think this hypervigilance is love. It isn't. It's survival conditioning wearing romantic clothing. There's a difference. But modern culture confuses the two constantly, especially online, where emotional performance gets mistaken for emotional depth. People can publicly discuss trauma, post vulnerable confessions, share emotional breakdowns, and still feel profoundly unseen afterward. Because visibility is not emotional intimacy. The internet taught people how to expose themselves emotionally, not how to feel emotionally safe after exposure. That's why so many Gen Z people feel emotionally drained after social interaction now. Even positive interaction. Because being perceived continuously is psychologically exhausting. Especially when identity itself already feels fragile. And queer people understand that fragility deeply. Many spent years emotionally shape-shifting for survival. Different personalities in different environments. Different tones around different people. Different levels of honesty depending on safety. That creates identity fragmentation over time. Not fake personalities. Survival personalities. There's a difference. Fake people perform identities they don't feel. Emotionally exhausted people suppress identities they got tired of defending. And eventually, they stop knowing which version of themselves feels most real anymore. That's one of the darkest consequences of chronic emotional adaptation. People become emotionally functional, while internally disconnected from themselves. And because Gen Z grew up online, that disconnection became normalized. Everyone's exhausted. Everyone's overstimulated. Everyone's emotionally distracted. Everyone's partially dissociated. So emotional depletion started looking ordinary. But it isn't ordinary. Human beings were never designed to emotionally process this much visibility. Thousands of faces. Endless comparison. Continuous exposure to beauty, relationships, identities, opinions, lifestyles, trauma, conflict, attraction, rejection. The nervous system absorbs all of it, even when people think it doesn't. That's why so many Gen Z people feel emotionally numb after scrolling for hours. Not because nothing affects them. Because too much affects them simultaneously. The brain protects itself by dulling emotional absorption. And over time, people stop feeling fully emotionally present anywhere. Not online. Not alone. Not even inside relationships. Because emotional overstimulation damages emotional rest. That's why compliments feel temporary now. Validation disappears emotionally almost immediately. People consume attention constantly, but rarely internalize it. So the emptiness returns faster each time. And eventually people become addicted to emotional reassurance without realizing it. More likes. More replies. More affection. More proof. More confirmation. Not because they're narcissistic. Because modern emotional systems trained people to fear emotional disappearance. Especially queer people who know what invisibility feels like already. People don't talk about this enough. LGBTQ plus exhaustion is not always dramatic rejection. Sometimes it's prolonged emotional translation fatigue. The exhaustion of constantly making yourself understandable to people who only partially try to understand you back. Explaining identity. Explaining pronouns. Explaining boundaries. Explaining complexity. Explaining emotional nuance. Over and over and over again. That drains people psychologically. Because interpretation analyzes. Understanding relaxes. Modern culture does the first one constantly. And almost never provides the second. So people become emotionally exhausted trying to prevent misunderstanding before it even happens. That's why so many Gen Z people now over-explain themselves constantly. Not because they're dramatic. Because they became psychologically conditioned to expect emotional misinterpretation. One wrong phrasing, one awkward reaction, one social shift, and suddenly connection feels unstable again. So people become emotionally careful, smaller, softer, more edited, not because they stopped caring, because authenticity stopped feeling psychologically safe. That's the real crisis happening underneath Gen Z emotional exhaustion. Not weakness, not fragility, chronic psychological exposure. An entire generation trained to emotionally perform themselves while privately struggling to feel emotionally real. And maybe that's why so many people secretly fantasize about disappearing for a while. Not dying. Not abandoning everyone. Just becoming psychologically unreachable long enough to exist without being interpreted. Without performing. Without monitoring. Without comparing. Without translating. Without proving. Just existing. Because underneath all the exhaustion, most people are not asking for fame, or validation, or attention. They're asking for something much deeper, emotional rest, the kind where the nervous system finally stops preparing for emotional danger. The kind where identity no longer feels like something that must constantly survive observation. The kind where connection stops feeling conditional. Because the deepest human desire was never visibility. It was safety. And modern life quietly taught an entire generation to confuse the two.